and using data to build better players. No, Sig Mejdal didn't write this one, but hopefully he'll read it. Ben Lindbergh is here from The Ringer and, of course, of all things baseball and analytics. And the book is The MVP Machine, How Baseball's New Nonconformists Are Using Data to Build Better Players. Ben, this might as well be the new Baltimore Orioles story, right? Because if we're going to build a bigger, better baseball club, and, we're going to lose 100 games this year, yet again, it's going to be through new methodology. So I'm glad your book is here. I know Luke is enjoying it. Great to have you aboard. How's the book doing, man?
Great to be here. Yeah, it seems to be doing well. And you're right, Sig didn't write it, but he is quoted in it, so maybe that's close enough.
Well, you have to find these guys in order to get to the heart of this, right? So let's start at the beginning. This is what you do in sort of building data and analytics and things that support it. It's sort of your story and your gift to journalism and writing things. But how did this one come about, and why this one right now? And I know a lot of people that love baseball are pouring through this one.
Yeah, well, I and Travis Sawchik, my co-author, just started to get the sense that we had entered a new phase of thinking and team building in baseball, because for the past 15 years or so, we've all been talking about Moneyball and the aftermath of the Moneyball movement. And of course, that's been based on finding undervalued talent, going out and getting guys who are already producing, but for whatever reason are undervalued by the market. Teams didn't realize them for what they were. And that's getting harder and harder to do, because there's no team out there that's not looking at past performance through a statistical lens, that's not employing smart stat people. So it's really hard to find pre-existing talent that's just sitting there. So now the big competitive advantage in baseball is not finding talent. It's more about creating talent or enhancing talent. It's about making players better more so than going and getting guys who are already finished products.
I came into this on the baseball side in the 1980s when I had my first press credential. And, I was just happy to be amongst Reggie Jackson or whomever, Fred Lynn happened to be running around at that point from my childhood. And then in 1996, football came to Baltimore. And my first relationship was with Marvin Lewis. And this is at a time when, Ray Miller's managing the Orioles, Davey Johnson, around that period where Sid Thrift is still running around, and Theo Epstein's just the intern sitting in the corner somewhere, headed off to Boston. And I was really struck by how the coaches in football work 365 days a year. They stuck around in the offseason. They had to look at young talent. They were watching film. They were looking for who to draft. And baseball was still very much an attaboy. Let's take a look at him in the cage, and we're going to move your hands an inch or two. And there was only Tony Gwynn, breaking down videotapes back then. And I thought, man, baseball's going to have this curve. And sure enough, the Greek god of walks comes along, and the Billy Beans can identify those guys. There's no more Greek god of walks, right? There's no more. There's only one. There really is only one way to do baseball, and that's the way it's being done right now. And if anyone from a past life were to come back 20 years later, they wouldn't recognize the industry, would they?
Yeah, I think you've nailed it there. And, there have always been free-thinking and open-minded people in baseball here and there who've been willing to challenge convention, and their experiments, go back to Branch Rickey's day, and he was pioneering player development methods, and there's the Royals Academy, and we talk about all these precursors in the book, but all of those movements would spring up and then they'd die out because baseball men didn't want to change. And for a lot of time, coaching was really the province of former players, and former players had been taught a certain way themselves, and that's how you became a coach. You were a former player who retired and transitioned into coaching, and then you would teach players more or less what you learned as a player. And that led to some stagnation. I think you figured, well, this was good enough for me. This is how I learned. This is how the next generation is going to learn.
Can you imagine Charlie Lau with chips and bats? And you know what I mean? That if that sort of coaching had been utilized in the modern era, probably like Lombardi if he would have had an iPad. You know what I mean? Would he have used it? But, if he would have used it, he would have been a better coach, right? It certainly has made Belichick, there's a guy that comes from old school to new school, a better coach on the football side. But on the baseball side, my God, the players now, and I think the Astros are the greatest example of that, of you take an ordinary player and bring this sort of information into Astro world, the Keuchels of the world can then blossom, right?
Right, exactly. And the Astros are the one team that we devote a chapter, actually the longest chapter in the book to, this is less of a team-centric book than a lot of the books in the Moneyball mold, because this is sort of a player-driven story and a coach-driven story, and it's not focused so much on teams because this stuff didn't start with teams. It started with outsiders, with independent coaches at outside facilities who were willing to try something new. And now that is getting imported into the game. And the Astros have been the team that has been at the forefront. So they realized, 2013, 2014, Jeff Luhnow, Sig, everyone who was there at the time, they had come from St. Louis. They had had this draft model that had enabled them to pick players really efficiently in the draft, but they recognized around 2013, 2014, they weren't getting that good value in the draft anymore. This is what we were just talking about, how the Moneyball model wasn't working because every other team was looking at players in the same way. So they realized we've got to pivot to player development. This is the unsettled territory. This is the next frontier. This is where we can make the biggest gains. And they did, and they were willing to, turn over their entire minor league staff, guys who had been there for a while who were not willing to get on board with how the new regime wanted to go about teaching players. They were out and new people were in, and the staff was new and it was larger. They invested heavily in technology. And obviously you see the results at the major league level, you see the World Series, you see the records, but it extends all the way down. I mean, from AAA to the Dominican Summer League, Astros pitchers are leading their leagues in strikeout rate. Astros hitters are getting the ball in the air and pulling it. It's just level after level, guy after guy. They're doing a really great job of instructing these guys from the second they get into their system, where they are immediately introduced to technology. It's just part of the pipeline, part of the process from the start. And I don't think any other team has implemented it thus far in quite as rigorous a way.
Ben Lindbergh is here. The book is out, and you can find it all over his Twitter. He's also very, very active out in the social media space at Ben Lindbergh with the H at the end, the MVP machine, how baseball's new nonconformists are using data to build better players. He's also out at the Ringer. You can find him there and podcasting and formerly Grant Landing and doing all that cool analysis stuff. For you and the baseball nerd inside of you, is baseball more exciting on this frontier than maybe basketball or hockey or football? I know football's trying to figure out how to analyze some of this data. Maybe baseball lent itself more to this over the last 20 years than other sports?
Oh, it definitely does. I think it's a combination of factors. In baseball, you have this incredibly rich data set. I mean, hardly any human endeavor has been tracked for as long in as much detail as baseball has, going back to the 19th century. So you've got this extraordinarily rich sample, all of this data that you can use to come to conclusions, but it's just also the structure of baseball, the way it's set up as more or less a series of discrete one-on-one matchups. It's just a lot easier to analyze, and it's more complicated than that. We think of the pitcher versus the batter, but of course the catcher is playing a part and the umpire is playing a part, and everything is a little more nuanced than that. But really, it is much more simple than, say, hockey, where you're talking about a lot of guys, just continuous action all over the ice, and to a lesser extent, basketball and football too. So all of those sports, really every sport has its own analytics movement now, and they're making great strides too. And in many cases, they've taken a page out of baseball's book and been able to apply some of the same principles. But the structures of those sports are just innately more resistant to that type of analysis than baseball's is.
Ben, for every forward thinker and everyone that wants to get to the moon, there's someone out there burning clean coal, right? And the Orioles were doing that here for a long time with Dan Duquette and Buck Showalter and, Peter, once again with his head planted firmly up the backside. And here we are losing 115 games. But if there's one thing the lads have gotten right, it's that there is this thing called analytics and this future thinking. And these cats down in Houston have figured it out. I've had Ben on, right Nestor ball. We've seen Sig Mejdal out doing speeches here on the backside of all of this. But more than anything, there was the thing that happened last year when guys got dealt into here from Houston and from New York and other places where they had employed analytics, and they walked into this system in the middle of last summer when the Orioles had their fire sale. The Dodgers guys specifically saying, oh my God, it's like we went to North Korea and we've gone behind the lines to the old world. And yet 6 months later, the new guys come in and here it is, chips and bats, all of the analytics, all of this new way of thinking. Boy, the organization and the players and young people, the first time they're exposed to this, most people have been exposed to this, but for the Orioles, this is the new world, the last 6 or 7 months, where everything old world got washed out, kind of like when the wall fell in Berlin, man,
Yeah, you're coming up with some really apt historical analogies here. Yeah.
Oh, wait till I get to Hellier and Lords of the Realm, man. Wait, that's coming next for you because I read your work, So anyway.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that's right. And yeah, you saw Zach Britton go within the same division from the Orioles to the Yankees, and he was like, wait a minute, there's all this information out here, and they share it with players. This is a whole new world I never suspected existed.
No wonder I couldn't get anybody out.
Right. So I think that has been a big problem for them, and they've had other problems, not signing international players and so on. I mean, it's
Oh, I live here. You don't have to tell me, man.
Yeah, right. I'm sure your listeners know. So I think, to some extent, look, they had their run of success. They were good teams for a while, and then a lot of teams almost inevitably, they, head down the other side of the hill, and that sort of happened to the Orioles, but it's happened very steeply, I think, because they fell behind in all of these areas. And the fastest way to catch up is to import people from the early adopter, from the team that's leading the charge. And that's what the Orioles have done, belatedly but wisely. And we've seen a lot of teams take that approach over this past winter. It was, free-for-all feeding frenzy on Astros front office personnel, Astros coaches. I think Luna was quoted once as saying that 1 in 5 front office positions was filled by a former Astros person this past winter. Every team wants an Astros coach. The Red Sox just won a World Series with Cora as their coach. I mean, I think that's what everyone wants, because you look at the team that's doing something different and having a ton of success, and you say, I want some of what they're having, and the fastest way to do that is to hire someone who knows exactly what they were doing. And so the Orioles, I think, they'll have an easier time implementing what they implemented in Houston because it's the second time around, and you know what worked and what didn't, and you can sort of start at the end instead of at the beginning. The other thing, though, is that other teams are catching up and other teams are ahead and other teams are learning the same lessons. So Houston was the first to do all this stuff when they were first tackling it. The Orioles now are playing catch up. And I mean, just getting to parity, getting closer to what the average team is doing, that would be a big boost. But I think it's going to be tough for them to leapfrog everyone else and build up the big lead that the Astros did by being the first.
Ben Lindbergh is here. The book is The MVP Machine. You can check it out. You can check him out at The Ringer as well as on Twitter at Ben Lindbergh. How baseball's new nonconformists are using data to build better players. The analytics side of this versus the excitement side, and I always like to tell the story of how last year, they took my press pass away, so I don't go to games every night anymore. The team stinks, so I don't sit in the upper deck anymore. I did my 30 ballparks 3 years ago, so I'm done with all that, although I do have to get to Atlanta now that they built a new place. But then I went to Pittsburgh last year, and I was sitting in right field. There was nobody in the stadium. It was on the backside of Ray Lewis going into the Hall of Fame, so I took some fans on the way back. And I sat up there for 5 innings, and I looked, and there's never a point, and maybe you don't see this on TV, so you have to sit in the stadium in the upper deck and really look and say there's never a point where the center fielder's lined up in center field, the left fielder's traditionally the way you would line up, that the shift is on now, that there is, it's like it would be like saying there's a traditional 43 defense in the NFL. There's no such thing. Everything's a hybrid, and everything's situational, and everything in baseball is now situational. I got to tell you, you watch it, and you watch the movements, and you see the strikeouts, and you see the home runs, and boy, do we see the home runs here, especially with the guys in the other jerseys here, Ben, and I know you'll be writing about that historically by August as well, if you haven't already. But whether we're building a better game, right? And I know that that's what, all the Illuminati, want to believe about all of this. Will the game be interesting 10 years? Will the people adjust to the shift? Or is the game going to somehow sort of throw a lot of this information to the side and say, no, we can't have the shortstop move to the other side of second base. No, we're not going to have relief pitchers come in and throw 3 pitches, then have the next relief pitch. You're going to have to face 3 batters. We're going to have clocks. All the things that are moving against the science, because I'm not sure that the science is good for the game in regard to getting me to pay to watch it.
Yeah, I think that's a significant concern, and that's something we talk about quite a bit in the book because, most of the book is about how players are getting better, and players are better than they've ever been before, but between the players getting better and teams getting better at deploying players, we're almost breaking baseball at this point. This is not really looking like the sport that most people grew up with in earlier eras, and change is not always bad, but I think...
By the way, I remember when being the DH in interleague play was the only thing I had to be pissed off about.
Sure.
Right?
I mean, yeah, I think it's a good thing that baseball is changing all the time, but I think that these latest changes, you can make a pretty strong case that they are spectator unfriendly because you've got a more static game. It's more all or nothing. There's, fewer balls in play. There's less base running. It's just, strikeouts and home runs are exciting. And even strikeouts can be exciting sometimes if you're watching on TV particular and you get to see all the details. I enjoy that at times, but I think that there is kind of a hankering to bring back a more dynamic version of baseball. And I don't think it's going to happen on its own. We've been talking for a while now about, baseball is cyclical and the pitchers do one thing and the hitters adjust and it's a pendulum and it swings back and forth. But at this point, I think we're going on something like 13 consecutive seasons of the strikeout rate rising. And I just don't see that reversing itself on its own. MLB is going to have to intervene and step in and say, teams got too good, players got too good. We have to rein them in a little. And the good news is I think you can do that. I think there are very simple measures you could take to bring baseball back into line with what it used to look like, at least a little bit more, deaden the ball a little bit, shrink the strike zone a little bit, do something with the mound, lower it, move it back, et cetera, et cetera. These would have real effects. So I don't think this problem is unsolvable. I just think that in baseball, there is such a knee-jerk kind of reflexive, we can't change anything. We're bound by tradition. Baseball's tradition is one of the best things about it.
Dude, they can't even put a net up to protect children. One of my dear friends was on the receiving end of the Mookie Betts line drive last September in Comiskey Park. She had facial reconstructive surgery. Literally Mookie gave her a bat, and he's been very nice to her children. But, they can't even get simple thing. They can't even get me a press pass, Ben. You know what I mean? Like, they get an empty stadium. We are here in Baltimore really concerned about losing the franchise, man. But this goes back to part of how do you win? You get nerds from Houston, and they do their analytics. And you know how you really win? You tank. You know what I mean? You get Adley Rutschman. You get 3 of them and hope that one of them doesn't turn out to be the pitcher that's no good and like all of that. And the tanking part of this, it sounded all romantic in Ben Reiter's, ode to the Astros guys. And I remember the 0.0 TV ratings in Houston years ago. And we're in the beginning of that here. And when we come out of it, the Orioles might be in Nashville or Las Vegas when the lease is up 2 years from now. So the tanking part of this is how you build a team, right? That is, and the fans have just sort of accepted that, hey, we got to suck for 5 years. I don't know that the business can survive that here in a place like Baltimore.
Right. There is a cost to it. The devil's advocate position is that if you can guarantee that you come out of it on the other side with a team like the Cubs or with like the Astros that can win a World Series, well, would you rather be truly terrible for a few years and then have that waiting for you and be able to look at the prospects that you have coming and dream about the great team that you're building? If that actually happens, is that preferable to just kind of treading water and, being a 70-something, 60-something win team and always being able to convince yourself that you're sort of in it and signing a free agent here and there, but never really making a run at it and constructing a solid team? That can go on for years and years, and it did with the Orioles in the past, right? So you'd almost rather rip the Band-Aid off and say, we're going to be truly terrible for a few years here, but it'll pay off. I can see the upside in that. The problem is that other teams are trying that today, whereas in the past, the Astros were kind of the first to do it as drastically as they did. The Cubs were early to that trend too. Now you kind of have a bunch of teams that are always in that phase of the competitive cycle. And so if you have a lot of teams that are kind of coming out of that rebuilding phase at the same time, then it's pretty difficult to guarantee that you're going to win a World Series to make up for the pain that you suffered there. So I think it's not an automatic, but there's things to be said as long as there's a plan, as long as it's not like what the Orioles were going through until very recently, where they were terrible, but there wasn't a sense that they actually had a way to build it back up again, which at least now it seems like maybe they have a vision for that.
Yeah, we all thought like giving away Kevin Gausman for a bag of baseballs and dealing Machado off a year and a half later than they should. I mean, all of these awful decisions have been sort of washed away by we suck more and we get the number one pick and we'll be fine again. It does sort of feel like it gets washed away a little bit. Ben, I tell you what, I don't know if you're if you drink beverages of the adult kind. I know all you folks watch the Game of Thrones, which I don't do. But if I were ever gonna like really go deep dive third beer in with you based on reading the Lords of the Realm piece about a month ago that you put up on The Ringer. That's the book that sort of changed my life, right? Like 1994, I'm a 25-year-old guy. I'm in a baseball-only city. There was no dream of football here. Camden Yards is new. Ripken's in the streak. All that's going on. 3.6 million people are coming to Orioles games. And there's a strike, and I wondered, why? And Kurt Schilling and Mike Messina and Jim Poole and all the MLB Player Association guys said, Glavin, hey, go read this book, this new book called Lords of the Realm. Boy, man, I collected baseball cards back in the 70s, and I always wondered why Steve Carlton wound up in Philadelphia and, why my cousin wound up in Baltimore, which led me here, and how Frank Robinson wound up in Baltimore, and why the Reds or the White Sox would want to get rid of Hall of Famers in the mid-'60s and ship them off to some godforsaken place like Baltimore where they never won. And I tell you what, the business of baseball, 25 years later, the book is here, and we're about to go into another big black hole based on the Adam Joneses of the world sitting out to the end of the curb and not being offered fair contracts into their 30s. Baseball's going to have there's going to be a hell to pay, I think. And if you read the book, and I know you did and you wrote about it, you talk about ripping the Band-Aid off the sport. Boy, Lords of the Realm changed everything for me. And there are people that read it and people that didn't read it. And if you didn't read it, you don't really have a very clear view of where this thing was in the past.
Yeah, that book really took you behind the scenes and showed you exactly how the players had made their strides in the labor movement and how owners had just mismanaged and mishandled everything for decades. And it really explained exactly how you got to the point that the sport was on the brink of, canceling a World Series. And fortunately, we've had decades now of relative labor peace since then. And, everyone's making money and the sport is profitable and record revenues, but tensions are ramping up again. And the issues are slightly different now than they were 25 years ago, but there are some parallels. And, to bring it back to the book, I think you can connect all these trends we've been talking about with what's going on in the economic market now, because you've got a greater realization among front offices that players who reach free agency often are past their physical primes, and so they're less willing to pay for that past production than teams in earlier eras were. But to tie it to player development, I think that's a big reason why we've now seen the average salary in MLB stagnate and even decrease slightly in back-to-back years, which is unheard of in the free agency era. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's because teams are looking at the alternatives there on the free agent market and saying, we can develop our own players who will not cost us as much and will replicate this production. We can promote a prospect who we've groomed from the start with all this information and technology, and they'll make the league minimum for 3 years. Or we can go get this, generic equivalent of the brand name guy, someone who doesn't have that track record and the big name and the big salary expectations. But maybe if we tweak his swing, maybe if we teach him this new pitch, maybe if we tell him to throw this pitch more than that pitch, he can replicate the production of that established guy who comes at a premium price. And
maybe you can buy Mark Trumbo and not have to sign Chris Day. Oh, that's right. We did them both. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem. And I think that's what the union is facing right now is, these things, again, are not going to reverse themselves. Teams are not going to forget what they have learned. So you've got to negotiate and you've got to take a hard stance and you've got to get players paid earlier in their careers. And that's not going to be something that owners are going to want to concede. And so that's where the threat of a work stoppage comes in, because that's kind of the ultimate leverage. And we'll see if they have to wield it this time around.
Yeah, they all have to wear the little braces instead of what would Jesus do. It's what would Marvin Miller do? What would he do if he were around? Because I think that's the question they're going to have to ask themselves, especially in the modern era where they have made so much money. I mean, in the past, the baseball owners didn't know how to make money. That's not a problem anymore, right? Like figuring out how to make money. If you want to know where all these rules and analytics and all this stuff's going, find out where the guys who think the money is coming from, wherever they smell the money, is where they'll take the game, quite frankly. That's what interleague play was about. That's what the DH is about. That's what the DH is going to be about when all the teams have it in a couple of years, right?
Right. That's absolutely right. And I think sometimes they act in a short-sighted way where they're looking at their year-to-year revenues and they're trying to maximize those returns, and they're not thinking about, well, what's the long-term cost of this going to be? And for each individual owner, maybe there won't be, because they'll offload their franchise and they'll make money hand over fist when they sell it, because sports teams have proven to be a really great investment. So I think you've got a problem there where what's good for any individual owner at any one time is maybe not the best thing for the sport. It's sort of like, we're talking about how players are getting better all the time, but that doesn't necessarily make the sport more entertaining. You've kind of got these misaligned incentives where what benefits a team or a player just doesn't always line up with what benefits the fan and the sport in the long run.
Ben, congratulations on getting the book out. You and Travis Salchik, The MVP Machine, How Baseball's New Nonconformists Are Using Data to Build Better Players. You can find Ben Lindbergh out at The Ringer. You can find him out on Twitter. I find him anytime he's writing awesome stuff. I don't read your Game of Thrones stuff or any of that stuff. You can tell Mallory the same thing. But anything baseball nerd related, you can assure that Luke and I are lined up to read it. Ben, always a pleasure to visit with you. Please don't be a stranger. Come on a couple times a year, man.
Thanks very much. It was fun.
Appreciate you. Ben Lindbergh, The MVP Machine. Go grab the book, Father's Day, summer reading. Read that one and then go back and catch up with Lords of the Realm, or read sort of as a prequel on all this stuff and Astro Ball and all the baseball stuff. Ben's written a book about how the Orioles are going to be built in the future and built right now, and the new nonconformists, I would say. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. I'm on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and Snapchat and Instagram, and streaming live on your Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. You can find me anytime, anywhere in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day. Podcast, listen to what you want, when you want, how you want. All of our Baltimore positive stuff up as well. We're at Fadley's with the mayor next Thursday on the 20th with Mayor Jack Young. We're going to be having some more great guests all summer long. You'll definitely want to check that out. The morning newspaper ships digitally to your email inbox each and every morning at 7 a.m. It's all brought to you by Planet Fitness at planetfitness.com, where it's always $5 down, $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life. Last but never least, breaking news all summer long comes first on the WNST Tech Service. That's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. Dennis Colatzos will be here on Thursday from 3 until 5, driving you home. It is the SSV on WNST. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 at WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking baseball and Baltimore sports.